What I'd like to do today is offer the listeners just a broad history of the yoga tradition, its roots, its developments over the millennia, and then see where we go from there. So maybe you could start at the beginning.
It's easy to say start at the beginning. It's kind of harder to know when the beginning is or what the beginning is.
So yeah, when is the beginning?
When is the beginning? I, one of the great challenges about studying the history of yoga is, first of all, that we're studying something that is undoubtedly very ancient. Secondly, we're studying something which is foreign. I mean, I don't use that term in any pejorative or disrespectful sense, but just in the sense that it's coming out of a culture which is not our own. So everything we say about when the beginning was, or everything we say about what happened pretty much up until the last couple of hundred years, has to be taken with a little bit of salt. It's all a little bit speculative. You know, the first earliest references we have that are pretty unequivocally to yoga as some form of system of practice come in some of the later texts called the Upanishads, probably looking at around, give or take a couple of hundred years either way, looking at around 300 BC or thereabouts. Now, as I say, those are the first references to the word yoga, clearly meaning a system of practice. But that's not to say that that's the origin of yoga. You know, yoga could very, very well go back earlier than that, much earlier than that. There's a common tendency to look at some of the artifacts that were found in the Indus Valley way back a couple of thousand BC. I don't know whether you've seen those, Ryan, but there are some really quite cute little clay seals that were excavated in the Indus Valley area, which is now in Pakistan. They're actually excavated in, I think, the 1920s, 1930s. And some of them have images on them which people have looked at and said, oh, yeah, look, there's a guy sitting in a yoga posture, or there's an image which looks to have some sort of yogic quality to it. The difficulty is that we just don't know whether this has anything to do with yoga or not. It's quite possible that a guy who's sitting in what looks like the posture that you and I will know as Baddha Konasana, maybe he is doing a yoga posture, or maybe he's just sitting that way because that's how they sat in those days. You know, it's very difficult to know.
Yeah.
So in terms of saying when do we really see yoga as a practice, acknowledging that it certainly may be coming out of earlier stuff, I would say the earliest clear reference is in those Upanishads of around 300 BC. Now, I guess the question that immediately throws up is, well, you know, what are they talking about there? Are they talking about yoga postures? Are they talking about breath work? Are they talking about meditation practice? I think again, we're being a little bit speculative, but the most obvious references are to practices of mental control, not necessarily to practices of physical control. But in the nature of texts of that age, you know, these are texts that were not, in some ways the word text is misleading because these were not written down for a good few hundred years after they were composed. They were handed on orally. So it's in the nature of a lot of old Indian texts that some of the juice perhaps is in what they don't say as much as in what they do say, because a lot of the teaching will necessarily have been handed down simply in an oral tradition from teacher to student, which was quite often also father to son. So we have to, I guess, put our guessing hats on a little bit to work out what they were talking about.
Can I stop you for 1 second? Because I had a question, and I'm kind of pleasantly surprised to hear you say that the Upanishads around 300 BC is what you would call the beginning of yoga as a formal system or formal practice. But you didn't mention the Vedas, and the Vedas are often uh, uh, pointed to as the origin of yoga practice or the yoga system. Do you have anything to say about that?
Sure. I think just to clarify what I was saying, I wasn't necessarily putting forward these Upanishads as the beginning of the yoga tradition, but simply as the earliest clear reference we have to yoga as practice. The Upanishads come out of the Vedas. The Vedic texts, the Vedic Samhitas, or the four collections are, well, who knows, but around 1500 to 1000 BC, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And a little bit like the way we can look at these artifacts that I was talking about out of the Indus Valley, we can look at things in the Vedas and say, oh yeah, maybe this is something to do with yoga. But also maybe it's not. Certainly, again, if we're thinking about yoga as a form of practice, there's plenty of quite abstract philosophy, or not so much philosophy is the wrong word, but plenty of quite abstract speculation in the Vedas. To my mind, the most important thing that we find in the Vedas that we can relate to yoga as we see it and as we practice it today is a section in a text called the Atharva-Veda, which talks quite a bit about prana. And prana, I think I guess the listeners will know, is a term that's used in yoga sometimes used just to mean breath, but more commonly used to mean the sort of underlying energy behind breath and behind sort of animation. And the Atharva-Veda does have, as I say, this section which praises the breath, praises the prana as being something clearly very important. And people have looked at that. They've said, oh yeah, this perhaps is a foretaste of pranayama practice. And maybe it is. Mm. There are other bits in the Vedas, as I've said, where people have looked at them and they've said, oh yeah, this looks like yoga. But it's very speculative. It's very speculative. We really, really don't know. There are plenty of other explanations as well for those passages. Mm-hmm. I think although the Upanishads represent a continuation of the Vedic tradition, they're coming out of the same cultural and religious sort of milieu society. They do also represent quite a significant shift in worldview, because in the ancient Vedic times, religious practice was very much focused around ritual. In some cases, sacrificial ritual, so throwing goats on the fire or whatever it may be. By the time of the Upanishads, there was a shift happening in Indian society, and that shift was, at least in part, a reaction against formalized ritual. And these rituals have got very, very complicated. Mm-hmm. And the reaction was characterized by what is very often referred to as the internalization of the ritual. The idea that rather than performing sacrifice, performing complex external ritual practices, that one actually took the ritual inside oneself. And here we do perhaps see a little continuity, because the focus of the internalized ritual was very much prana. It was very much the idea of the breath. So although there is a continuity from the Vedic tradition, there is also this quite significant shift from external practice to internal practice. And I'd like just to add here too that we shouldn't overlook the role of Buddhism. The Buddha was living just a little bit before the Upanishads that I've mentioned, these early Upanishads that talk about yoga as a system of practice. And we shouldn't underestimate the fact that Vedic society, Brahmanic society, what we later called Hindu society, we shouldn't underestimate the fact that that was having some interaction also with Buddhism. So the mental practices of Buddhism could well have had some influence into these later Upanishads.